For the latest, we now cross to SABC News Correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease for more on this matter. Sherwin, thank you so much for joining us this evening on that breaking news coming out from The Hague. Of course, the court has indicated, Sherwin, that it will hand down a provisional judgment in relation to South Africa's case, claiming acts of genocide against Israel. Practically, what does that mean and what should we expect?
Yeah, so for our viewers watching at home, take a step back, right? There are two main thrusts to the ICJ case that South Africa has presented against Israel in terms accusing Israel of violating tenets of the Genocide Convention to which both South Africa and Israel are signatories to. The first question that South Africa has asked the court is to basically determine whether Israel is committing genocide. So this is a broad question. This is a slow-moving train that is going to take the court some years to ventilate. In addition to that question, South Africa has asked the court, while it is grappling with the merits of the broader issue of genocide, to impose provisional measures, while it's still considering the genocide allegation, provisional measures that will change the conduct of the party, of the state party, in this case Israel, in relation to its military operations in Gaza. So South Africa is seeking provisional measures, essentially one could call it perhaps a injunction that would be imposed on Israel that its behavior in terms of its military conduct in Gaza changes. So the court is going to very much deal with this narrow question that the South Africans have asked, not in terms of whether Israel is committing genocide or not. That's the broader question that will take some years to ventilate, but whether there are provisional measures that can be instituted right now by virtue of the court's order for Israel to change its behavior as it relates to the catastrophe, the humanitarian catastrophe, the military operations that we are seeing currently play itself out in the Gaza enclave in Bali.
And Sherwin, what are some of the examples, of course, speaking hypothetically here, when it comes to some of the possibilities in terms of what the court might demand from Israel in the short term in relation to the war in Gaza?
Yeah, a question very much, that relates to the purview of the 17 justices, the 15 permanent ICJ justices, and of course the 2 ad hoc justices that were appointed by both South Africa and by Israel. And so when you talk about provisional measures, you are talking about temporary measures the court can impose to change the behavior of parties on the ground. Similar to, the legal term is often used, is called an injunction. So it's to prevent irreparable harm from occurring while the court, as I mentioned earlier, is deciding on the broader merits of whether Israel is in compliance or in violation with its obligations in terms of the 1948 Genocide Convention to which it is a signatory. So the court could, for example, say Israel is no longer in the interim, no longer allowed to use explosive weapons in densely populated areas, that its military posture on the ground has to take, the prevalence of civilians and civilian infrastructure into account. It could order, for example, greater access of humanitarian aid across various checkpoints in southern Gaza and in northern Gaza. It could order, for example, Israel to open more border crossings. It could order the allowance of greater medical supplies into Gaza, given the fact that we've heard time and time again from the WHO, from UN officials, that this is a health system that is virtually near collapse. So these are the types of, hypothetically speaking here in Bali, measures that the court in the interim could impose on Israel to change behavior right now, while, of course, and let's emphasize this, it grapples with whether Israel is committing genocide or not, but that is, of course, a longer-term question. So provisional measures are temporary measures that change behavior on the ground as it pertains to the catastrophe we are seeing unfolding in Gaza today.
And Sherwin, one would say that there have been a number of concerns here raised about whether in fact Israel will comply with an order from the court. And what's your reading of how this might unfold if, for example, a provisional order imposes immediate obligations on the state of Israel?
I think what's instructive in this instance, right? I mean, in the broader context, we always talk about whether Israel is going to comply with its legal obligations. There are, of course, Security Council resolutions in terms of settlements, for example, which Israel has not complied with. So they are legally binding instruments to which Israel has not adhered to the letter and spirit of those legal prescripts. So in this instance, you have Israel showing up in court to defend itself. And so that's the first indication that Israel, in terms of, the court's jurisdiction, in terms of the Genocide Convention, Israel showing up has in itself acknowledged the court's jurisdiction here. In addition to that, I'll read you what the UN Charter says. Article 93 of the United Nations Charter. Remember, the ICJ is an organ of the United Nations. It's a judicial organ of the United Nations. Like you have the security organ of the Security Council, you've got the General Assembly, you've got the Economic and Social Council. The ICJ is the judicial organ of the United Nations, the World Court, which says all members of the United Nations are ipso facto parties to the statute of the International Court of Justice. Ipso facto essentially means by virtue of the fact that you're a member state of the UN, you are then under the jurisdiction of the legally binding decisions of this court. A state which is not a member of the United Nations may become a party to the statute of the International Court of Justice on conditions to be determined in each case by the General Assembly. It goes further on to say in Bali, Article 94 of the UN Charter, each member of the United Nations undertakes to comply with the decision of the International Court of Justice in any case to which it is a party, and if a party to a case fails to perform the obligations incumbent upon it under a judgment rendered by the court, then the other party in the case, for example South Africa here, may then have recourse in the UN Security Council. So Israel has showed up in court. It has recognized the jurisdiction of the court in terms of determining whether it is in violation of the Genocide Convention of 1948. It has presented its arguments to the court, and the UN Charter tells us that it is by this notion of ipso facto a party to the statute of the International Court of Justice, which means that any decision by this court is legally binding on Israel and that it must comply. Whether it does or not will be left to the state of Israel. Because there is no immediate enforcement mechanism. The ICJ doesn't have a standing army that's going to invade Israel and demand that it comply with the orders of the court. But the founding document of the United Nations, the UN Charter, says Israel has obligations under the Charter in terms of adhering to any order that is handed down by this court, including the one that will be handed down on Friday in Bali.
And Sherwin, let's flip the coin here a bit and look at both sides of the matter. And what is the possibility of this court also ruling against South Africa's case?
Well, that is certainly a possibility, right? There are two main questions here. Is Israel or is Israel not? Is Israel in compliance with its obligations under the Convention of Genocide of 1948? It certainly used the second day of argument to make that very case, right? South Africa is saying it is not in compliance with its obligations under that treaty and has presented its case to the court. What the court must decide is A or B. Are they or are they not? But we're not going to get that decision on Friday. We are only going to get a decision as it relates to the behavior of the parties in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip today. This is not going to be about the broader question about whether Israel is in violation of its treaty obligations. This is very much to deal with the conduct of Israel, the conduct we are seeing on the ground in Gaza as it pertains to the current rights of Palestinians, forced displacement, their access to healthcare, their access to food, water, sanitation, infrastructure, sanitation and water, for example, that has been destroyed in these military bombardments. So this is going to be a very narrow decision by the court in terms of whether Israel has to change its behavior on the ground, but it certainly will not be dealing with the broader question as to whether Israel is in compliance with its obligations in terms of the 1948 treaty or not.
Sherwin, thank you so much for your time this evening. That is our US correspondent there, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, talking about that breaking news coming in this evening, of course, that order to be handed down by the International Court of Justice on Friday.